Alrighty, welcome back to episode 4 of the We've All Been There podcast. Wow, we're already 4 episodes in. I think we just keep getting better. This space, this office.
Hey, yeah, we got new digs, man.
Looks amazing.
It looks great.
I love it. We're so happy that you're joining us again, episode 4. Like I said, if you haven't checked out our previous episodes, make sure to check us out on all the platforms. We got Apple Podcasts, we got Spotify. You can check us out on YouTube. Whatever is convenient, whatever works for you, check us out and make sure you stay along. So, yeah.
Yeah. I've been having a good time doing this together, Max. I'm
me too.
excited that we get to do it. And, you know, our heart is that we would be relatable. That's kind of the reason we call it the We've All Been There podcast, is that, you know, it's the content is good, hopefully. I think it's pretty good. But, you know, it's not just about the content. It's about connection.
Yeah.
And just being a place where, you know, we can just say, hey, there's some topics and some things that we've all experienced that maybe don't get talked about other places, or sometimes other places might talk about things. And we tend to be, I said it last month, we tend to be kind of binary when we're preaching or when we're teaching. And we're like, it's either this or that. And we know there's a lot of in-betweens, you know, that you don't have time to talk about in a 30-minute sermon, or that not everybody's willing to open up and go, hey, you know, we're kind of in the in-between there. And so that's kind of what we want this podcast to be about. And we don't always get it right. That's, you know, the truth, that we don't have it all figured out. But our word is to just try to be a place that is relatable, and that we can connect on some topics that many of us experience. Many of us go there and just be able to say, hey, we've all been there. We've all experienced that before. So with that being said, I know that this month we're talking about something super upbeat and super light.
Absolutely.
And it's just it's going to be like just one of those easy ones that we're just going to flow right through, right?
Yeah, right. So this week we're talking about how we've all been sad. And
man.
It's weird to say this. I know it's going to sound weird, but it's definitely a week that I've been looking forward to.
Yeah.
As weird as that sounds to say, but I think as pastors, we can be bad at it. And I know for myself, I have been bad at it. And at times I can slip into that spot where I'm like, you know what? I'm just not going to feel these things, because I feel like it's frowned upon to be sad in ministry. Like, you love the Lord, God is good, why are you sad? And so I guess that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, man. And I think it's a big one for a lot of people. And again, like you said, as pastors, a lot of times we just try to put on a happy face.
Yeah.
And we kind of have to, because we're in front of everyone and everyone's looking at us. But I think it's important to talk about those moments when we feel grief and loss and sadness, the things that we experience in ministry. And I think the most important thing to say to start it out is it's okay.
Yeah.
I think it's okay to be sad at times. It's okay to recognize that emotion when you feel it. I think that God gave us emotions, and every emotion that he gave us is for a purpose. There are plenty of moments of sadness in the Bible. There was, you know, one prophet who wrote a whole book that was all about sadness. And so I think it's okay to acknowledge it and to talk about it.
Yeah.
And that's what this podcast is about, is to be a safe place to talk about things that maybe don't get talked about other places. And so we've all been sad.
Yeah.
You know,
You've been sad.
I have. Yeah. And I again, like when we share these things, it's not to say, hey, everybody feel sorry for me.
Yeah.
Or to say even that I've gone through things, or that you've gone through things that are worse than what others have gone through, because we know some of our sadness, things that we've experienced, is nothing compared to what others have gone through. But I know I have. You know, I was thinking about, as kind of preparing for the podcast, for me, 2021 was probably one of the most difficult years of our ministry. I've been in full-time ministry now for more than 25 years. I've been a lead pastor for 23, I think it is, years.
Come on.
And but 2021 was probably the most difficult of all of those years as far as my own personal emotions. And the reason is, you know, I was thinking back to 2019. We had worked so hard. Our church was was really at a place where it was beginning to grow and really starting to see some of those dreams that we had in our life when we planted the church really start to come to fruition. We had just moved into a brand new building in March of 2019, and we were seeing that upward trend, and we were hitting some goals and some numbers and some things that I had always dreamed in my heart, and I could see on the horizon like one big number that I thought a couple years from now we're probably going to hit that, because we were seeing that great upward trajectory, and we'd worked really hard to get to that point. And then of course we all know what happened in March of 2020. We were going to give 2 weeks and slow the curve, and then that 2 weeks turned into months and years, and man, I have to be honest. When they first said, hey, you can't meet in the building, and everybody kind of went online and all that kind of thing, I tell you what's funny is I was actually a little bit proud that we were like, hey, we're one of those churches because at first they were like anybody, any gathering over 500 or whatever it was, and I thought, oh yeah, we're big enough to be one that can't meet together or whatever. I thought that was actually, wow, and yet that didn't last 2 weeks. It lasted months. And even in that first year, I remember feeling pretty hopeful and thinking, well, things are going to get back to normal, and even thinking I'm a good leader. I can lead through this thing, and we can make this thing happen. But then when we finally came back to church in the building, I'm sure other pastors that are listening experienced a similar situation. We only had about 25% of our people that attended our church came back in person. And I was shocked, because I remember, I don't know if you remember those memes that were like, when church opens back up, we're all going to run back, and oh no, that is not what happened at all. And thinking, wow, this is going to be harder than I thought, but still thinking, hey, we're going to get through this. God is faithful, and He's going to help us. And we actually started to see a little bit of momentum as people came back to the church, but then we have another spike in COVID, or there will be a mask mandate or something like that. And it would, go back down to that 25, 30%. And I remember that kind of starting to feel a little bit heavy, but still feeling, okay, somewhat hopeful, thinking, okay, 2021 is going to be the year. Things are going to get better. It's going to get back to normal. And to begin the year, it started to a little bit, we started in the church, started to see things get a little bit more back to normal. We started to see some momentum. And then, I don't know if you remember what happened in February 2021. We had the Ice-Mageddon. Come on, you remember that? And we had done one of our big series at the movies, and it was in February. We had just started the first Sunday of February, and it was supposed to be the thing that this is going to help draw people back to church and help us reach new people and things like that. And that first Sunday of February was like one of our best attendance that we had, and I saw a lot of new people, and I started feeling really hopeful. And then boom, Ice-Mageddon. We're all locked in our homes again this time because of the ice and things. And then we had pipes burst here at the church. Ooh. And big old mess and some of the areas of the church, and we had to have church online, and again we lost all the momentum, and at that point I'm going, what is going on?
Yeah.
And then I thought, well, okay, Easter. It's going to be Easter 2021. We're going to be back. And then Easter 2021 came, and it was good, but we weren't back. And it was after Easter 2021, I remember that's when I hit a wall. And it was like there was not much hope, not much motivation. I think probably for the first time in my life as a leader, as a pastor, I think I wouldn't have said it at the time, but I look back and think now I was battling depression.
Yeah.
And I remember I could barely talk about church without crying. Tears would well up in my eyes. I remember trying to talk to one of my mentors and another kind of leader in my life, and talking to him about church, and just like, he said, do you think you're depressed? And I was like, I think maybe so. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd lay in bed on Mondays, just not want to get up. But even in that state, I had to keep on leading.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the hard things about being a pastor or a leader. Like, even when you're sad, you got to keep leading. You got to keep I couldn't like, hey, I need to take a break here because we were in crisis mode, And I think that first year of COVID, it was like crisis mode. Gotta survive. Gotta all the adrenaline that you got to get to make it through that. And then I think somewhere around that Easter time of 2021, all of that kind of the extra adrenaline kind of was gone. And man, I was sad.
Yeah.
I was discouraged. I was depressed. And a lot of people go, well, I mean, what's the big deal? It's just church. But for me, it's not just church because it was our whole life. we planted this church. And so 15 years of pouring our heart and our soul and everything that we had into that. And then, suddenly it was only a fraction of what it was. And I remember feeling those overwhelming feelings of all the work that was lost, of the dream that was lost, and then of the people that were lost, the people that had been there with us. And then I'm looking around, I'm like, where are they? And people that I thought were going to be with us. And I'm looking around and going, they're not here. And people that I reached out to and they ghosted you. They didn't respond.
Yeah.
I remember we were at a conference around that time. It was the first part of February, first part of 2021. Might have been April-ish or so. And we're at this conference with some of the other staff, and we're all sitting at a table, and somebody brought up one of the guys, and I hadn't seen him, and he was somebody I was close to, and I'd reached out to and wasn't getting a whole lot of response from, and they hadn't come back to church at all. And I remember like I had to get up and leave the table, walk around the building where we were at this conference for about 30 minutes just because I couldn't hold back the tears. I didn't want the staff to see that I was struggling so much, and it was painful. And I didn't know it really, probably at the time. My counselor helped me to understand it, is that what I was feeling was grief from loss, that the sadness came from the loss. And a lot of times I know that we only think of grief, or we only think of mourning or grieving as something that happens when someone dies. And for me, I didn't have anybody that died. Thankfully, I know a lot of people lost loved ones during the pandemic and things like that. But for me, it was like the loss of some dreams and the loss of hope and loss of relationships. And those are real losses too. And so it's not just when somebody dies. And so for me, it was really key to recognize what that was.
Yeah.
So that I could process it. So that was kind of, I've had other seasons of sadness, but that was a more extended season. I would say all the way through 2021 into the early part of 2022 that I was really, really experiencing that.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned this whole idea of like going back to normal. Mm-hmm. And it's like, even to this day, you will walk into places, restaurants, buildings, whatever, and you can still see that there are signs of people being afraid or people being conscious. I know my previous boss at Chick-fil-A, like even to the last day that I worked there, he was afraid to be too close to people. Like he would still wear his mask around people. And it was just this reminder that it may look like everything's fine and it may look like everything went back to normal, but this is the new normal, Mm-hmm. And so it was hard for us to go through such a season, especially as a leader. You not only faced city mandates, you didn't just face state mandates. Like we were going up against the world. Mm-hmm. Like this was uncharted territory. It was ground that we had not, been on before. And so a lot of, pastors, I know I'm glad I wasn't in that season because, it was a forging through the fire. It was an incubation period of like what you went through either like crushed you or it like forged you, and to some it was both, Mm-hmm. And I know for you, even as you tell your story, like there was a low season in that. And I know like coming out of that, like I get to experience Pastor Chad through the fire, right? Yeah. Like you were forged through the fire. The leader I see now, you can see it on you, It's like I went through that season, people don't like necessarily like see your grief, but like that is part of who you are now. Like you experience that, and so you're a better leader for it. But I don't think any of us would have wanted to go through that season, that you went through.
Yeah, and I know I'm not the only one that went through that season.
Absolutely.
Other pastors and other leaders who went through similar. I mean, the whole world was going through the pandemic, and everyone experienced it differently. It was different in different places, and every church handled it differently. But every pastor and every leader had to experience it in some way.
Yeah.
And so that's why I wanted to talk about it.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
And I know there's other reasons to be sad. I don't want this to be just a pandemic podcast here.
Yeah, right,
that was
right.
just my experience, but I wanted us to talk about it because I wanted to recognize that we all experienced it, and we've all experienced it. We've all gone through things like that, and you have to process those things. We'll talk about more later in the podcast what happens if we don't process them. And the dangers of that, and if we go through these seasons of sadness without talking about them with someone, processing them with God and with people in our lives that love us, then there's a danger in that. And so I think that's why it's important to just get it out there and talk about it.
And like, the pandemic is not this is not the pandemic podcast, I guess, but it is something that we all went through. And so I think it's easy for us to go like, hey, we all went through it in a different way, though.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, you did. I mean, you were talking about what it was like for you working in management at Chick-fil-A.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was, gosh, when we were talking through this podcast, I was like, what was sad for you during that time?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, for me, it wasn't as much sad as it was kind of frustrating. So like, I was an executive there on staff, and it's weird because we all kind of like, it doesn't matter who you are, like we're all going to be doing something, and it's going to be like our role shifted a lot. I was less kind of over the organization and more like in the day to day. I mean, we did 12-hour shifts during that like season, and it was tough. I mean, I was used to doing like 8 or 9, but doing 12 like back to back to back was just like, it was tough. And so it was a weird season because I remember I would go outside for hours, and we were like in a hazmat suit. We had a face shield on, we had a mask on, and it's like 100 degrees. And I'm just like, this is miserable. Like, this is not what I signed up for. And it was in those moments too that I was like, man, I wish I was in ministry. Like, but then I was also like, man, I wish I wasn't in ministry. And so it was just super.
There's a few times when I drove through Chick-fil-A and I was like, I wish I was working at Chick-fil-A.
Yeah, right.
I never did that. I'm just joking.
But yeah, I know for me, like probably one of my saddest seasons that I walked through was me stepping out of ministry. So I stepped out of ministry in 2016, and it was super difficult because for me, I began to ask myself questions of like, wait, what do I do now? Like, who am I? Like, did I disappoint the Lord? And I felt super alone. Because in that season, a lot of the people that I was close to, I was no longer close to. And for whatever reason that was, I was alone, and for me, it was just like an identity crisis because my whole life had led up to that moment that I would be a pastor, that I would be on staff, that I'd be in ministry, that I'd be doing this thing that I felt the Lord called me to. And all of a sudden, I'm not doing that anymore. And so I'm like, what do I do now? For me, I had made my whole life just like, this is the one thing I'm going to be good at. And if I'm not good at this one thing, then I don't know what I'm supposed to do, And so for me, I was really bad about it. I did not grieve that season. I just acted out. And basically I grabbed the blanket and I just threw a sheet over my season. I threw a sheet over what I was going through. And so for me, I didn't grieve that loss. I didn't grieve the hurt, the failure. I just went numb. And for me, people knew me, and they knew that I was predominantly a happy person and predominantly would be cheerful. I would joke around, and like for them, nothing really changed because I just kept that smile on. I just pretended like everything was okay. But inside, when I went home, when I slept, when I was in my bed, I would feel that. I knew I wasn't grieving that season. And so, that season lasted for several months until, I started working at Chick-fil-A. But yeah, during that season, it was pretty bleak. It was pretty dark in my mind. But everybody else just kind of saw, oh, like he's taking this well because like he's not grieving.
Really let anybody else in. Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that was probably for me like the more.
Yeah, and you think about that. You spoke about your identity, and then also some of your community. When you're in ministry, a lot of your community is the people you're ministering to and with.
Yeah.
And so then when you're not, I think that was a thing for me during that season too. That was a big part of the hurt and the sadness, the pain was some of the community that I had lost, people that I'd loved, people I thought were with us, and then for whatever reason they weren't. I know it's easy to kind of be mad at somebody or why were they not there or whatever. Now that I'm kind of come through it a lot, I have more of an empathy for them too. Like, well, I understand a little bit. I think that they could have stuck around. I do. But I also I'm able to kind of understand from their point of view what they were going through, and it's helpful a little bit. But you can't experience that when you're in the middle of that sadness. It puts it changes the way you think and the way you experience life in those seasons. And if you don't deal with it, if you don't process it, and there are different ways to process it, but if you don't figure out some way to process it with somebody, with the Lord, I think it needs to be a combination of those things.
Yeah.
Then there's some dangerous paths that you can go into. In fact, I just wrote them down for our podcast here, things that happen when we don't deal with grief or loss or seasons of sadness. The first thing that can happen is we kind of lose your head. And when I think about this one, I think about the story of Moses. Moses was a great leader. He was called to lead the people out of slavery. And yet we know the story of Moses and how he messed up. He kind of lost his head. He did something stupid that ended up costing him the promised land. We see that story in Numbers 20, that most people probably remember that story, that God tells him to speak to the rock. But instead of speaking to the rock, this time he strikes the rock, and the water still comes out just like it did the last time. But then he's disqualified, from leadership. He doesn't get to go into the promised land all because of that moment of weakness. And I read that story. I think I've thought about that story a lot. Like, what in the world was going on? Because Moses was always a strong leader, and he had always obeyed God. I can't remember any other times that he didn't do what God asked him to do. But then this time he just kind of did what he wanted to do, and he kind of lost his head. He kind of did, he wasn't himself. And I never noticed this until I was studying it a while back, and I noticed a line in there that if you're not careful, you just jump right past it, and you miss the significance of it, because it's only, I think it's like 6 words. But in Numbers chapter 20 and verse 1, it says, in the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried. And then it goes on and talks about how he struck the rock and whatever. But most people don't think about there Miriam died and was buried. And we don't think about who Miriam was. Mm-hmm. Miriam was Moses' sister. Moses' sister died. And all she gets is 6 little words there.
Yeah.
Moses' sister died, but Moses was too busy being a leader to stop and grieve that loss. He never took time to just be sad. And because he never took that time to be sad, he ended up kind of losing his head, ended up doing something that ended up costing him basically the end time of his ministry, the thing that he had been promised, the promised land. And man, I just think, how often does that happen in ministry? That I know there were times when, I was tempted to do and say stupid stuff. I know there were times when I'd be, on the stage, and I'm processing my own grief through my own sermons, and it would come across with me crying, on the stage or whatever, and having to I got to pull this together or whatever.
Yeah.
I fortunately never did anything that was, disobedient or immoral or wrong that would cost me in ministry. But I know that, when you're in those moments of grief and sadness, like you can kind of do dumb stuff. And that's what happened with Moses, is he ended up doing something that disobeyed God. And I always thought, why is he so mad? Well, anger is one of the steps of grief.
Yeah.
It's actually there's denial, and then the second one is anger.
Yeah.
And there he was. He hadn't intentionally processed it, but he was in that grief. His sister had died. And so I just think, like, how many pastors end up having moral failures, or cheating the church out of some money, or saying, maybe they don't do something as bad as, having a moral failure, but maybe they end up saying something on social media out of anger, or to someone else out of anger, and it ends up causing them to kind of forfeit some of the influence that they've built over the years. And it might be because we never took the time to properly deal with our sadness and grieve the losses, because ministry is filled with losses. It may not be your sister that dies, but you have people in your church family that you love that die, or you have hurts that happen, you have dreams that die, you have disappointments that come. And if we don't recognize those things for what they are, we can end up doing a Moses thing. You can lose your head, and it can end up costing you way more than you ever wanted it to.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you shared that story, it kind of like blew my mind a little bit. And then it reminded me of, in that same passage, in those same chapters, we see Aaron die as well. And we look and see how they grieve that, how they mourn that. It says that they mourned his death for 30 days.
Wow.
Like
they learned something from Miriam, maybe even.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And it's just this lesson for us that, like, you have to grieve the loss.
Yeah.
Like, you have to mourn the pain. Like, and that's not the only instance that, like, we see the Bible talk about mourning and loss, that even when, like, they are disobedient to the Lord, or they do something wrong, or someone dies, like, that they would, like, rip their clothes off, that they would wear sackcloth and, like, put ash on their head. Like, that's how intense they would go about feeling that grief. Because maybe if you were at that conference and you didn't, go and cry and have that moment, like, it's because you did cry. It's because you did grieve that you didn't have these things happen.
Yeah, I think, man, if you bottle all that stuff inside, it's eventually going to come out. You keep stuffing it down, but it's eventually going to come out, and it's going to come out in a way or in a time when you don't want it to come out.
Yeah.
And so you have to process it in a healthy way and at healthy times, so that it doesn't come out in unhealthy ways and in wrong times, just like it did for Moses. So I think the first thing is that you have a tendency to lose your head if you don't process grief. The second thing I think that happens is sometimes you lose your heart. And this is a little different than the first one, because sometimes you lose your head, and everybody knows it. Everybody saw Moses and what he did, right?
Right.
And that happens for some people. Everybody sees it. But then there are some times when you lose heart, and maybe it's not as noticeable to everybody else, but you know it. And what I'm talking about is that maybe you didn't do anything stupid that cost you your ministry, but you just kind of lose your passion. And, man, grief seasons can cause us to lose heart. And the passion that was once there, it's not burning as bright and as hot as it did at one time, because we are going through a season of grief. I think about the disciples, and I think about when, as followers of Jesus, when Jesus was crucified, I can't imagine the grief and the loss that they must have felt. They put all their hope in Jesus. They had left everything to follow him. They're believing he's going to overthrow the Roman Empire, set up his kingdom and rule with them. But now he's up there on a cross, and there he's buried in a tomb. And so you experience the loss that they feel. I think about Peter. Peter lost heart.
Yeah.
I mean, this has happened to Jesus. Not only that, but he had messed up and he had denied Jesus. And what was his response? His response was that he went back to what he knew before. And he just went back to being a fisherman. Okay, this discipleship, this being a disciple thing is not working for me. I'm just going to go back and be a fisherman. And I think, I think we see this in pastors and leaders in what we've gone through in the last couple of years. think about how many pastors and church leaders have just thought, I'm going to go back to selling cars or doing real estate or whatever, because they've gone through this season, and they just they didn't do anything that disqualified them from ministry. They just lost the passion for it, or lost the heart, or just got discouraged. And Kerry Newhoff on his podcast gave a stat that said 42% of pastors and church leaders in 2021 thought about leaving the ministry.
Wow.
42%, and I know in those moments, I don't think I thought about leaving the ministry, but man, I know that the passion for the ministry was not what it was. I definitely didn't have faith to believe that it was gonna get better, and that, when I think about that, I think about Thomas after Jesus had died. You think about, we don't call Thomas faith-filled Thomas, we call him doubting Thomas. And what did he say? He said, I'm not going to believe it until I see it and I feel it. Yeah. And that's what happens a lot of times in times of grief or in loss. We lose heart. It's hard to keep having faith. It's like, I want to believe it, but I can't. I'm not going to believe it. I remember thinking, I'm not going to believe the church can ever come back till I see it. You show it to me, but I didn't believe it. And it was like there was so much grief. There's so much loss. Like Mary when she went to the tomb.
Yeah.
And she's looking to just anoint the body of Jesus. And there's so much grief and so much loss. There must have been tears, so many tears in her eyes, that Jesus was right there. You remember that story?
Yeah.
And she couldn't even recognize him.
Right.
And I think that's what grief and loss does, is that sometimes, like, God is working. We just can't, our eyes are too filled with tears. Our hearts are too broken, and we can't experience him. We can't see him. We can't feel him in those moments. We just kind of lose heart. And I know, one more thought, and then I want to get your thoughts on it too. But I remember during that season that there were a lot of people that very well-meaning people that loved me, who were just trying to help, but they would say stuff like this. They would say stuff, well, focus on what you still do have. There's still all these people that are here. You still, and I would be like, I love you, but that doesn't help,
Yeah, right.
And I remember what it felt like. It felt like someone's, I have 3 wonderful children, and it felt like someone, it felt like if my son died, someone saying, well, you still have 2 other beautiful girls. Just focus on that. And like, nobody would ever say that, because you would be like, well, of course I love these 2 girls with all my heart, but that doesn't take away the sadness,
and it doesn't take away the love
that I lost, and it doesn't make me love them less. It just, like, it wasn't helpful. So people saying, well, just focus on, you still have a great church, you still have, yes, and I'm very grateful for that, but I can have grief and gratitude both at the same time.
Yeah, I
can still be grateful for what I have, while still grieving the things that I have lost. And so I don't know why I brought that up, other than if you're trying to help somebody, that doesn't help. And then maybe also if you're going through that and someone has kind of tried to help you by saying something like that, to let me just validate, what you're feeling. It's real, and it doesn't take away from what you still have. To go ahead and take a moment, or moments or weeks or however long it takes, like, to process through what has been lost as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that last part is so good. I think so often, I know for myself, I'm a fixer.
Yeah.
I like to fix people.
Yeah.
And that's not good. That's not a good thing. And so because of that, when people are sad or people are hurting, I'm like, what can I do to fix this?
Yeah.
Nothing. Like, don't worry about fixing it right now. Like, just worry about being there, and even grieving with them.
Yeah.
I mean, again, going back to that story of Aaron, like, it wasn't just one person that grieved. It wasn't just
together.
The immediate family. It talks about the people of Israel grieved together. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh, so grieving is a community process. It's not just a solo process. Like, got it, Mm-hmm. And so I think in that, it's like, yeah, don't tell me the glass is half full right now. Mm-hmm. Don't tell me, like, well, look at the bright side. Like, just be here with me. Yeah. Like, I'm going through this, and I know we've talked about it before. And
we kind of talked about it last month a little bit. Yeah,
about it last month. But Yeah, no, I think you're so right.
And that's helpful too. Even as a pastor, even this last week, I've been texting back and forth with different people in the church that have been going through difficulties and things that are happening in their family and things like that. And every time I want to say, is there anything I can do to help? Mm-hmm. And so I guess that's not as bad as like trying to fix it for them, but even at the same time saying, what can I do to help? And almost every time they've never said, well, you could do this or that. They always say, just keep praying for us, and just you checking on us, that means the world to us. And so I think on our side of it, when we're not in the season of sadness and we're going, we got a spouse or we have a friend, we have someone who's going through sadness, sometimes just knowing it's okay to just be there, just being there is incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
So when we've going through seasons of loss, sadness, it's easy to lose your head, it's easy to lose your heart. Then the last one that I had here is that it's easy to lose your hope. And that after a while, it's easy to just decide you just want to give up, Mm-hmm. And that's where a lot of people maybe find themselves. I don't think I felt I didn't feel like giving up in 2021. I thought, well, maybe I'll do something different. Those thoughts came across my mind a little bit, but not giving up. I do remember a season about 10 years prior to that, 2020 or 2011, that I did feel like giving up. And we'd gone through another difficult season where we had a youth pastor's wife who had an affair with the worship leader who was volunteering in the church. And there's a long story I don't need to go into, we don't have time for. But, man, I remember at the end of that season having a moment. I've told the story many times to the church and people that I'm sitting on the side, like on the bathtub in our master, bedroom, crying. And it's the only time I ever remember Amber, she sat down next to me, and her saying, if you want to quit, I'll support you.
Wow.
Because I was ready to, like, just throw in the towel.
Yeah.
And almost like her saying, it's funny because almost her saying, if you want to quit, I'll support you and I'll be with you, was what made me go, no, I'm not quitting. You know what I'm saying? It was like, it became like that was, because always before I could be like, I just don't want to do this anymore, and know that Amber was going to be like, no, we're called to do this, and this is what, And so that was kind of my safety net there. But when she was like, then it was like reality. Well, no, I can't quit, I can't quit. We got to keep going or whatever. And so, but I know a lot of people have experienced those moments.
Yeah. Do you think that if you had thrown in the towel, do you think you would have like come back? Or do you think you would have just been, I'm going to do something else?
I think I would have eventually been back in ministry for sure, because I know that that's who I am. It's what I'm called to do. I remember having a conversation with one of my mentors one time, and it was during that season, and saying, I don't want to quit being a pastor, but maybe I could go be an associate pastor or something, so I didn't have to carry the whole weight of the whole thing, And I remember talking to him, saying, maybe I can come work for you, because he had a big church, And him telling me, like, I could hire you and you'd do a good job, and I would hire somebody that I would hire. He said, but you'd be sitting in my office 2 years from now saying, I got to go plant a church, or I got to go pastor a church, because that's what's in you and that's who you are. And so now I'm so thankful that I didn't go get a job as an executive pastor or something, or whatever, because we come on the other side of it. That situation in 2011, I can look back and go, wow, like, look where our church is now. We came through that. God was faithful. He helped us. I'm so glad that I didn't. And I think that's the hopeful part. I know we're going to make this into a two-parter because we're already bumping up against the time. And we've got some practical, more upbeat stuff that's helpful to kind of go, how do we deal with and how do we process through the sadness? But maybe as we kind of wrap up this, this first part or whatever, I guess, of it. Yeah, the positive is that a year ago, I would have not said, I'm glad I went through that season. A year ago, I would have been like, can we just go back to 2019 and the way things were then? But now I'm able to say, I'm thankful for that season that I went through, because I'm stronger. The church is stronger. I have experiences that I've learned that have made me a better leader and a better husband and a better person and a better pastor. But not just that, but I wouldn't probably be doing this podcast and trying to be a help to other pastors and other leaders if I hadn't gone through that season and experienced some things that I think can be a help to others. And so now I can look back and go, I'm thankful for that season. I would not trade that season. I would not, if there was a magic time machine and we could get in a DeLorean and go back to 2019 and never have a pandemic and whatever, I wouldn't do that because, I'm not the same person that I was then. And it's because God brought me through all of that, and I'm not sad anymore, And I can talk about this stuff without crying. Without even getting all that emotional, and it's a help to others too. So.
Yeah, I know for me, my just encouraging word in this piece of it is that you don't grieve alone. Something that I was comforted in that season was that the Lord feels. He has emotions. Mm-hmm. Like, he's not void of emotions, and so he feels grief. He feels anger. He feels compassion. He feels love. He feels all of these feelings. But what's different from the Lord than us is that whenever I'm sad or I'm angry, I can do something stupid, or I can just like get in a spiral. Mm-hmm. But the Lord isn't driven by his emotions.
There's the mic drop moment right there.
The Lord does not act outside of his character. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I'm comforted in knowing that when I was in that season of like loss of identity and purpose and just like confusion and frustration and grieving and acting out and all the pieces, like God's heart was like broken for that God was like in that place with me, that I wasn't alone in that. And so for me, that just brings a lot of comfort, even as I grieve to this day. As I go through things, he's seeing that, he's experiencing that with me, that he's sad with me, he's angry with me, that he feels those things, but not to the point where he's an act outside of his character.
Yeah. Man, that's so good. That's so good. And I think that's another huge benefit of going through a season like that, is that you learn how to grieve. It's a skill.
Yeah.
You learn the process, you learn those things. And so you go through another season of grieving, and it may not have to last as long because you learn the process of how to mourn and how to grieve. And so I know I've gone through other, that was a big one, but I've gone through other things, and I've had to recognize, you know what I'm feeling right now? That's grief. And so I learned some skills on how to deal with that.
Yeah.
Let's apply those skills, and maybe then I'm sad for a day or a week rather than 6 or 8 months.
Yeah, for sure.
So
cool. Good. Well, I think that's it for part 1. Make sure to check out part 2.